The following is a summary of the Sicha of Shabbos Parsha Shoftim Tov Shin Nun Aleph. The parsha starts with the words Shoftim v'shoitrim titen lecha b'chol she'orecha. Appoint judges and policemen in all your cities. And there is a pasuk in Yeshaya, chapter 1, verse 26, where Yeshaya, the prophet Isaiah, talks about a future time when v'ashiva sheftayich kvarishena, I will return your judiciary as it was originally, v'yoyatzayich kvatachila, and your advisors or your counselors as it was in the beginning. And based on that verse in Yeshaya, is the nusach, is the text of the tefillah of the Amida in the Shemona Esrei, when we say, Hashiva sheftenu kvarishena, please return our judges as they were initially in the beginning, v'yoyatzenu kvatachila, and our advisors as in the beginning. Now, we've spoken many times that we have already finished all the preparations for the coming of Mashiach. And consequently, we have already reached that time when, in that promise of Yeshaya, Ve'ashiva sheftayach kvarishena, ve'yoyatzayach kvatachila, and the idea of the yoyatzayach and its beginning has already in fact begun, as we will explain in this Sicha. First of all, let's contrast the pasuk in this week's parsha, Shoftim v'shoitrim titen lecha b'chol she'orecha, appoint judges and policemen, with the pasuk in Yeshaya, with the verse in Yeshaya which says, Hashiva sheftayach kvarishena, v'yoyatzayach kvatachila. And we're going to point out 4 differences between them. Number 1, in the Sedra it says, Shoftim, judges, v'shoitrim, and policemen, titen lecha b'chol she'orecha. You should appoint in all your cities. So you have both the judge and the policeman. Whereas in Yeshaya, it only says, Ve'ashiva sheftayich kvarishena. It mentions judges, but it doesn't mention police. Why? The second question, in Yeshaya, it mentions something else. It says sheftayich and then yoyatzayich, which are advisors or counselors. Where do we get this additional idea of the yoyetz, of the counselor, and in what is the counselor different than the judge? The third thing is, if you have a look at the Hebrew language of it, it says, Hashiva ve'ashiva sheftayach kvarishena, I will return your judges as they were in the beginning, ve'yoyatzayich, and your counselors kvatachila, as when they started. So in Hebrew, you've got 2 different words. You've got Rishona said in connection with the Shoftim, the judges, and the word Techila in connection with the Yoyatzim, with the advisors. Why the change in language? What is the difference between Rishona and Kavatachila? And finally, the 4th question is, it says in the pasuk in Yeshaya, Ve'ashiva sheftayich, I will return your judges. This is an expression of one person speaking to another. And again, it says, Yoyatzayich, your counselors. And yet, in the pasuk in our Sedra, it just says, Shoftim v'shoitrim, appoint judges and policemen. It doesn't say your judges or your policemen. Why in the pasuk in Yeshaya does it talk b'loshen noichach directly as talking to another person? So the Rebbe develops the following idea. First of all, what is the difference between shoftim and shotrim, judges and policemen? judges make judgments. They are poisek es hadin. A shoiter, a policeman, is a body of enforcement. It makes sure that the ruling that the judge has delivered is enforced. Now we understand why in the Pasuk in Yeshaya, which talks about the future redemption, only judges are mentioned, but not policemen. Because in that era, it says, Va'ave ruach hatuma min haaretz, I will remove the spirit of impurity from the world, and therefore there will be no necessity to have police who will enforce the law. All that we will need in that time are the actual judges who will deliver Torah rulings, and in fact that will be in a form of aliyah, in a form of malin b'kodesh, of an elevation in matters of holiness, elevation after elevation. But we won't actually need police to enforce it. And that, in fact, is already hinted to in the name of the Sedra. The name of the Sedra is Shoftim, just Shoftim, not Shoftim and Shotrim. And the reason is because the shoiter, the policeman, is only there in certain times when it's necessary to enforce the law. However, if there will come a time that it's not necessary to have the policeman because people will keep the law in and of themselves, it won't be necessary to come to the police, then all we'll have is the Shoftim, and hence just the name of the Sedra, Shoftim. Nevertheless, what we will have in order for the law to be fully received, we will need an additional element of yoyatzim, of advisors. What is the difference between a shofet and a yoyetz, a judge and an advisor or a counselor? The difference is a shofet delivers a judgment as if you're coming from above. He, the judge, is on a higher league than the person being judged, and the person being judged also receives the judgment from the judge in a form of kabbalas oil, of acceptance of the yoke. In other words, it's out of a certain level of bitul, of self-abnegation, nullification to the judge, who is higher on a pedestal, if you want. When we say a yoyetz, an advisor, a counselor, that implies that what is being given is an eitzah tova, a good piece of advice. And when a person receives a good piece of advice, it means that the yoyetz is close to the person to whom they are giving advice. They're rather like a good friend who is giving a good piece of advice for and bespoke for that person, and consequently they're ready and willing to receive it. Now there's an advantage in each one of them. The advantage of the yoyetz is that the person receiving the eitzah, the person receiving the advice, feels in a demonstrative way that the advice that's being given is meant for them. It's for their benefit. That's what they feel. They feel the closeness of the advisor. Whereas there is an advantage also in the judge, that when the judge delivers something, it's coming from above. It's in the form of a decree. It has the power of the Torah ruling behind it. Or stated somewhat differently, when we talk about the shofet, what comes out, what stands out, is the being of the judge. When we talk about the yoyetz, the advisor, what stands out is the being of the person receiving the advice. Because the idea is that it should go inside them in an acceptable and an inner way. This is rather like the difference between the avodah, the service of God, milamayla lamata, as it comes from above, or milamata lamayla, as a dynamic from below. The judge, if you want, is coming from above. The yoetz, the advisor, and the good piece of advice is coming from below. So now we will understand the difference and the nuance in the language why it says, Shiva Shofteinu Kavari Shoina, return our judges, and it uses the word Rishona, V'yoyatseinu Kavatachila, whereas in reference to the Yoyetz, it uses the word Techila, because the word Rishona implies something which was always there in the beginning. It's on a higher, if you want, pedestal. That's the shofet. Whereas the word techila means the beginning of something. The process has already started. When the yoyetz comes in, they've already started working with the recipient to make sure that what is instilled is done willingly and with understanding and with desire. And that's why it says in terms of le'osid lave in the future, Hashiva v'yashiva shoftayich, Yeshaya uses the word shoftayich, your judge, and yoyatzayich, your advisor, speaking literally to the other person, because what will become manifest in the times of the Geula is that what is being delivered from above is expressly for the benefit of and the best for the recipient. And hence it's not said in an aloof term, shoftim v'shoitrim, but rather it's said directly to the other person. This all becomes sweetened by the explanation of the Shach on the Torah, a commentary called the Shach al Torah, who explains at the beginning of this week's Sedra that when it says, appoint judges and policemen in all your gates, b'chol she'orecha, so the Shach explains that this also alludes not just to the appointment of judges and policemen, but it literally means we should appoint judges and policemen in the gateways of our body. The gateways of the body are the two eyes, the two ears, the two nostrils, and the mouth. Every person should appoint a judge and a policeman by each one of these orifices to make sure that what goes in and out is appropriate and kosher. And consequently, the gateways, she'arecha, your gateways, become yours in the sense that these judges and these advisors will make sure that you fully understand that you need to use your eyes, ears, nose, mouth appropriately. Since all that which will come about in the days of Mashiach is dependent on our service in the time of Golus, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, therefore, midah kemerged midah, measure for measure, there must be some form of service now which is the beginning of the process which will culminate then. And therefore, now also we must have the element of the shofet, which is receiving rulings from judges who rule according to the law of Torah and accepting them by Kabbalah's oil with great acceptance and yoke of heaven. But there also must be the idea now of the yoyetz. The yoyetz is the advisor, the counselor, the person who's giving an eitzah tova, the person who makes those rulings palatable, understandable, and able, and empowers you to integrate them fully within. And this is achieved through the shoftim and the yoyetzim in every generation, for they are the shaluchim, the emissaries of the original Beis Din, as it says in the Torah that one should listen to the shofet asher yiyeh bayomim hahem, to the judge who will be in your generation. And it says Shmuel in his generation was like Moshe in his generation, and each generation has a leader who is the shofet of that generation. We find actually the difference between the shofet and the yoyetz reflected also in the difference between Torah and Nevuah. Torah itself stands higher than the world. It's Chachmasoi Uretzona Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Torah is defined as the wisdom and will of God. Nevuah, prophecy. It says of prophecy, Gila Sodei Alidei Avodav Hanavim, that God revealed his secrets to his servants, the prophets. And when prophecy was received by a prophet, it was received in their mind and in their intellect. And it was said by them in a way that they articulated the will of God specifically and bespoke for a generation. In fact, the word Navi comes from the word Niv Safasayim, which means the movement of the lips, because the Navi had to enunciate and articulate and clearly say what God's word was to the people to whom they were addressing. And consequently, we can correlate Shofet with Torah, because the Shofet teaches and, if you want, delivers Torah from above. The Yoyetz, the advisor or the counselor, this is correlated with Nevuah, with prophecy. In fact, it says of prophecy that it comes from the koloyos, from the kidneys, which are yoyatzos, which give advice. In Kabbalah, it's correlated with the spheres of Netzach and Hoid. And this is more, if you want, directed to matters of the world. So you have Torah, which comes from above, and Nevuah, which is specifically bespoke to the generation and the people to whom the Navi is speaking. The Rambam writes, Miyasoidei Hadas, that one of the foundations of our religion is Shahakadosh Baruch Hu Menabe B'nei Adam, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives human beings prophecy. And even though the Talmud in Tractate Yoma, page 9b says, Misha Mesu Neviim Ha'achreinim, that once the last Neviim, the last prophets, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, passed away, Nistalka Ruach HaKodesh miYisrael, the Holy Spirit departed from the Jewish people. Nevertheless, the Rebbe explains in the Sichas Chelik Yudalet, page 72, that the word Nistalka means it was removed, but it doesn't say it completely disappeared. And in fact, we find throughout the generations that many great sages were inspired with Ruach HaKodesh, and the Rambam himself writes in his epistle to Yemen, his Igeres Taimon, that in fact, Nevuah will return, prophecy will return to the Jewish people before the coming of Mashiach, and that is a prelude to the days of Mashiach when prophecy will abound. So, in order to accept all of that, now there also has to be an element of haschola, kevatachila. And that's why the Rambam himself is marich. He goes at length and explains the whole concept of prophecy, even though the Rambam was after the time that prophecy or Ruach HaKodesh had ceased, because the Rambam is delineating and is saying as a halacha that there can be somebody like Moshe. In fact, it says of Mashiach, the Mashiach will be a prophet who will be close to the level of Mashiach himself. In our generation, who is this Shofet? Who is this Yoyetz? It is the Rebbe. And especially because it says that in each generation there is one person who is a potential Mashiach, who is Roy to be Mashiach. Therefore, it makes sense that Nevuah will return in their days, especially since the Nevuah of Mashiach will be, as we mentioned before, and close to that of Mashiach. And of course, that will manifest itself even before the Geula. Now, the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe already, had made the announcement that we've finished everything which is needed in order for Mashiach to come. And certainly that applies after the times of the Arizal, which he said, mitzvah legalos hachachma, it is a mitzvah to reveal the esoteric wisdom. And certainly after the times of Rabbi Hussein and Nesienu, all the Rabbeim of Chabad, which we see starting from the Baal Shem Tov on, we see matters of nevuah, prophecies which they made, predictions which they made, and they could see things which mere mortals could not see. They could use the oir, the light of the Torah, which was hidden inside the Torah. They could see with that misoifa olam ad soifo, from one end of the world to the other. And they often said predictions which were literally bullseye, which were bang on in terms of their predictions of what would happen in many, many different matters, of medical matters and in political matters and in matters of worldly matters. So therefore, we have in the Nesiim, we have in these Rabbeim two elements. Number one, they are Shoftim, they're judges in their delivery of Torah. And number two, we have Yoyatzim, we have people who give advice and counsel even in the material world, who are exact about their counsel and their predictions. And certainly in our generation, when we have completed the dissemination widely of Chassidus in every corner of the world, including translating Chassidus into various different languages, Russian, etc., and even lately, as we mentioned in last week's Sicha, a Tanya was printed in Braille. Therefore, the avodah now is midah keneged midah, measure for measure, that as we come towards the full redemption, we need to accept upon ourselves the directives of the man Malkei Rabbanon, the kings who are our sages, and especially the directives of the Rebbe, who is the Shofet, the judge of our generation, the Yoyetz of our generation, and the Navi of our generation. Especially because we saw by the previous Rebbe things which he said, predictions which he made, which were absolutely to the point. And the rule is a Navi who attests that another person is also a Navi, that person doesn't need testing. And so too in the generation after the previous Rebbe, which is talking about our generation, which we are the Talmidim of the previous generation, this all the more so applies. So therefore, the Hairah, the instruction that we have from all the above is that we need to publicize to everybody in this generation that we have merited, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has chosen a person in this generation, somebody who is head and shoulders above the generation, and is a shofet, a person who teaches Torah, a yoyetz, a person who makes palatable and in an integrated way what is being given over, and is a Navi, makes predictions in this generation in all matters, and especially in the matter of the Geula, where the Rebbe has said, La'alta Geula, that we are in the last generation of Golus and the first generation of Geula, and that immediately we should merit the Geula, and that was said as a Navi, that was said in a form of a prophecy. And therefore, since we are now in our Farbrengen, and we are in the 4 cubits of the Rebbe, and there are men, women, and children here, therefore all should accept upon themselves the directives of the Shofet, of the judge, and the Yoyetz, and the Navi, b'chol sha'arecha, in all our places, in all our gateways, and as we said beforehand, in all the gateways of our bodies. This has also a general connotation in terms of the human being. The human being has a body and has a soul. That soul is a neshama. That neshama should become the shofet, the judge, the yoyetz, the advisor, inside the person themselves. In other words, what should be judging, what should be directing, what should be guiding the person? It should be their neshama rather than their body. And that should be in both their eyes and ears and nostrils and mouth. 2 eyes, one for asay tov, for the line of positivity, and the other one for sur mera, for turning away from evil. In both of those, we need to fulfill the heirois, the directives of the Rebbe, who is like the Even Shasia, who is like the foundation stone inside the Beis HaMikdash, which although it was in a specific location, Chazal say, Mimena hushsas kol ha'olam, from there was founded the entire world. Because since the world was founded from this one Even, it rests and relies upon that Even. And consequently, on that Yoyetz and Shofet and Navi is founded the entire generation. And especially as we move from a year of Niflois Arenu, where we've seen miracles, Tavshin Nun Aleph, and we're moving into the year Tavshin Nun Beis, which is Niflois Bina. So we're moving from an idea of Chachma to Bina, from the Shofet to the Yoyetz. And especially as the Haftorah of this week says, Anoichi, Anoichi Menachemchem, or as we express it, Ad Masai, that until when do we have to wait for all this to be literally fulfilled? We should speedily be in the Beis HaMikdash, where it says, Tovu Sha'areha, the gates of the Beis HaMikdash sank into the ground by the destruction, and through our appointing of Shoftim v'Shotrim, through our appointing of judges and Yoyatzim, and our acceptance of the Navi and the Shofet and the Yoyetz of our generation, we in the Sha'arim, we will be able to build up again the Sha'arim, the gates of the Beis HaMikdash. The building will come down from above, and we shout out Ad Masai, until when do we have to wait for the time period in which Hashiva Sheftenu Kabarishena, where our judges will have full reinstatements as there was at the beginning, V'yoyatzayach kavatachila, and the counselors as it was. And all that should happen, Teikef Umiyad Mamash.